What does it take to kill the most problematic and resilient animals on the planet? This was the question that in 1962 to 1977 led the United States government into dumping over 500,000 pounds of cancer-causing chemicals over U.S. soil, all in a fruitless attempt to win a war that ultimately couldn't be won against the pinnacle of invasive species, the red imported fire ant. Hello everybody, welcome to Zooaholics, and today we're going to be discussing how America waged war on the red imported fire ant, lost, and ultimately learned that the only way to kill such a formidable adversary is to kill everything else living alongside them. Now, to give a little bit of background information, I actually discovered this story while conducting my own research on a native ant species called the Florida harvester ant. And while I was doing this, I noticed there was a very strange gap in the range of this ant that didn't quite make sense. After talking with a lot of local experts, it became clear that there was some kind of larger issue to the region as a whole, that at some point had devastated the local fauna, and even had an effect on people that's raised the rate of leukemia and other cancers in these regions. Eventually, someone from the USDA pointed this story out to me, and as I've gone further down the rabbit hole, I can honestly say I cannot believe I've never heard of this story until now, and so I've decided to share it all with you. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into it. If you live anywhere in the American Southeast, Midwest, or for some reason Los Angeles, you've probably had a run-in with these ants before. Whether it was at your local nature preserve, in your own backyard, or somewhere on a city sidewalk, these ants have continued to expand their range and dominance. And not only that, but they cost about $6 billion a year to America in damages and mitigations. Not to mention the untold chaos that happens in our local ecosystems. We believe that these ants landed in mainland America sometime in the 1930s, and ever since then, they've expanded their range and dominance, causing untold destruction wherever they go. Now, you might think killing ants would be a pretty easy problem to solve, but it is surprisingly difficult. I've had my fair share of run-ins with fire ants, and I have tried flooding them, digging them up, burning them, and let me tell you, these things have an answer for everything. You dig them up, they will be right back where you dug them up from a day later. You flood them out, they will build a raft with their own bodies. You can't drown them. I've tried setting them on fire. This is something that works a little bit better, but it only really slows them down before eventually they rebuild. Not to mention, they actually like living in habitat post-burn, so you're really improving their home. Of course, it didn't take long for the United States government to realize that there was a serious issue at hand, and they did what they do best, made it worse. With the ants expanding across all of the southeast regions, all the way up as far north as Virginia and Maryland, the United States government saw red imported fire ants as a threat to agriculture, public safety, and overall the environment itself. With scientists all across the country noticing these ants coming into play, and farmers not being too happy that they have a new problem to deal with. Not to mention that nobody likes getting stung by fire ants. They are very annoying, and some people, they can even be life-threatening. So the government hatched a plan to develop poisons and other pesticides to wipe out these animals. During this time after World War II, there was a lot of experimentation with chemicals. Nobody really had a good handle on how to get rid of these things. And then comes along Mirex. Mirex is a very interesting chemical that you've probably never heard of because it's been outlawed since 1978. Now you might notice that that timeline is dangerously close to the war on ants. And we'll get to that in a sec. But just looking at this chemical, you can see it doesn't look very friendly. If you look at the build of Mirex, it's very interesting because it's like 2 pentagons, 2 squares, and then a bunch of chlorine spikes coming off of it. It doesn't take a chemist to tell you that this is probably going to cause cancer. But at the time, they didn't really understand that. All they knew is that Mirex definitely killed red imported fire ants. Now at the time, Mirex and another very similar chemical, which we'll talk more about later, were widely available on the market. You could get them at basically any store that sold pesticides. So it wasn't uncommon that these chemicals would be used to kill pests. The first recorded government use of Mirex was in 1962 at an experimental site in Gulfport, Mississippi. This was decided by the Agricultural Commissioner of the state, Jim Ross, and he was convinced that there were little to no side effects of its usage. Another thing to note was that the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, had not yet been founded. That wouldn't come along until the 1970s. This meant that between 1962 and 1970, all of these chemicals were fair game. There was no regulation stopping people from using them, and there was no reason to think that they were dangerous in any way. All they knew is that it killed fire ants when they ate it. Now, a lot of times they would mix either soy products or different baits with the Mirex in order to get the fire ants to eat it. And of course, they knew that other things would end up eating it, so they began testing on rodents pretty early on, and they began to see very quickly that Mirex absolutely does cause a lot of different problems. Particularly, it messed up the reproductive cycles of lots of things, caused ovarian cancer, liver cancer, and even kidney stones to form in a lot of the test rodents. Now, this is something that we'll see develop in humans further on, but it's less conclusive than the studies done on mice in a lab. Now, the decision to use a synthetic chemical that nobody knew the results of just goes to show you how desperate the government was to wipe out these ants. They were causing, at the time, already hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damages, and they were trying to do whatever they could to mitigate the spread of red imported fire ants. The decision to use this chemical came from a place of pure desperation. At the time, environmental studies were a very emergent field, and seeing a species jump from one set of islands all the way over to a continent and eat everything is scary. They had no idea how far these animals would spread, so by all means, in their eyes, chemical warfare was necessary in order to wipe out these ants. That wasn't until a very similar chemical had a major incident. The Capone disaster in Hopewell, Virginia led to an overall decrease in the public's trust in the usage of chemicals, particularly as pesticides. Now, the important thing to know about Capone, otherwise known as chlordacone, is that it is basically the same thing as Mirex. You take that same evil spiky chlorine ball, you swap out one chlorine for an oxygen, and you have Capone. And wouldn't you know it, Mirex, in a natural environment, oxidizes to become Capone. I think you can see where people are starting to put two and two together here. This incident contaminated the James River and all of Chesapeake Bay for a very long time, and there are still traces of Capone in it till this day. Mirex continued to be spread over hundreds of thousands of acres in rural Mississippi, but at least now, people were beginning to suspect that this might be a bad idea. It wasn't until 1970 that the Environmental Protection Agency was formed under the Nixon administration due to a rising concern in environmental issues, most notably due to dumping any kind of chemicals into rivers and onto land, and basically anywhere else. John Quarles Jr., who was the administrator of the EPA, came against this project heavily and fought for the outright ban of Mirex at the time. Since at this point there was a lot more research done on the chemical, and we knew that it had a really bad effect on anything that would ingest it, including people. Not only that, but at the time, not many people knew that Mirex had an incredibly long half-life, which means that once it's in the environment, it stays there for a long time. And even when it degrades, it becomes Capone. Despite a lot of these concerns, people like Jim Ross genuinely believed in the usage of Mirex and believed that putting chemicals like this in the environment was a means to an end and a worthy sacrifice to defeating the imported fire ants. I like to imagine he sat over a balcony in front of his staff and said, "Some of you may die, but that's a sacrifice that I'm willing to make." Mirex continued to be crop dusted over the entirety of South Mississippi. The spread and usage of Mirex was anything but calculated. In fact, they were flying very large batches and crop dusting massive acreage because the goal was to wipe them out across a mass amount of area so they couldn't just fill the space back in entirely. Now, this is a good thought in theory, wipe them out entirely from an area and keep them from filling back in those gaps. But that's assuming that all of the red imported fire ants die. Even though they were dumping so much Mirex across so much land, they were still not killing them all. They were definitely decreasing red imported fire ants numbers by quite a bit, but they were by no means wiping them out. But I'll tell you what they were wiping out, a lot of very sensitive native species. This kind of leads me back to how I found this story in the first place. You see, there are a lot more than just red imported fire ants in locations like South Mississippi. There's going to be whole stacks of different native species that are living there. And you might think, well, they're ants, even the native ones are going to be pretty tough, but the truth of the matter is, a lot of these animals are much more environmentally sensitive than the invasive counterparts. So when you dump a bunch of poison, a bunch of ant poison across a mass amount of acreage, the most sensitive species that eat the poison are going to be the ones that get wiped out entirely. That's going to include a bunch of pyramid building ants. It's going to include a bunch of carpenter ants. And of course, the case that I'm on here, it's going to include your Florida harvester ants. Sure, they're mostly living over in Florida, hence the name Florida harvester ant. But this environment here is a perfect place for them to be living. So the question is, why aren't they there? It's because they got entirely wiped out by the dumping of Mirex, particularly across a lot of USDA lands, which is going to include the national forest, which is where most of the harvester ant habitat was. You see where I'm going with this. During this time, countless other species faced the impacts of Mirex dumping, and whether we realized it or not at the time, people were going to be victims to this chemical usage. Thanks to the EPA and John Quarles Jr., the usage of Mirex throughout the United States was decreasing and decreasing. Except, of course, in Mississippi. You see, Mississippi had one of the last production plants for Mirex that was open in the country, and they had sunk a lot of government money into producing it, distributing it, and they basically thought it was going to be one of their golden gooses for the state. But then along comes the EPA, tells them that they can't do it. But not only that, the state was determined to try and win this war against the fire ants before they get cut off. And so they continue to dump Mirex by at least 45,000 pounds a year across the South. Now, Jim Ross had not given up on his goal to use Mirex to wipe out the ants, but he was facing a lot of public backlash for its usage. So he said that he would reduce his usage in Mirex while also still keeping it within the pesticide, because he knew that it was one of the very few things that worked really well to kill these ants. However, it was also at this time that the state of Mississippi was forced to shut down its Mirex production, responding that we recognize the issue that fire ants cause the region, but there must be a safer pesticide to use. If anyone else lives in the Southeast right now, you can probably determine they did not, in fact, find a safer pesticide to use. At the time, the argument from the EPA was that there was no real documentation of these ants destroying livestock or destroying environments, and so the aggressive tactics that were used to destroy them were not economically viable or wise. We now know that this was definitely the case, and while Mirex was not the thing to use, wiping out fire ants 50 years ago probably was a good idea. The Environmental Defense Fund was another public law firm that was also very pleased to hear that Mirex was being banned. Come 1976, Capone, the chemical that was dumped into the Chesapeake Bay, was outright banned. Mirex essentially becomes Capone in a natural environment, and it was still not outright banned. This is thanks in part due to the state of Mississippi still using Mirex. After years of being told that this is a bad idea, and finally now having lab results that confirm that Mirex can lead to different cancers, they are still using it. Albeit less, they are still trying to get rid of their supply of Mirex by crop dusting it across the state. How did nobody get sued? I'm convinced somebody had to. In 1976, another 45,000 pounds of Mirex was crop dusted over the state, with 1977 only 20,000 pounds of Mirex being dumped. Way to go from 20 tons to 10 tons of cancer-causing chemicals across everything. That's great. But it was clear that Mirex was on its way out, and so now all that was left to do was look at the results of it, look and see how are these ants doing, and it made absolutely no difference whatsoever. These ants are still here. They were still there then, but hey, I'll say, if this was a war on harvester ants, they did a good job. Daggum, they wiped those suckers. Come 1978, and Mirex was finally officially banned in the United States, and its production ceased across the board, never to be legally used again. Now, there's been a lot of cases of Mirex contamination to water sources. There's a very famous one up in Ontario into the Niagara River, which we still don't necessarily know how that happened, as well as other countries continued their production of Mirex. But as far as the United States goes, we shut it down, and we no longer use it as a pesticide for killing red imported fire ants. However, like I said earlier, Mirex has an incredibly long half-life and can still be found in trace amounts in water and in soils across South Mississippi, Southeast Louisiana, and even South Alabama. Not only do we still have isolated instances of Mirex contamination, but we also have it wide scale, mostly due to state and environmental departments not realizing that this is a big issue and transporting fish or other contaminated animals across natural boundaries and bringing Mirex into water sources or soils that had not previously been there. You know, if you look at the actual war that was happening in this video between the Department of Agriculture and the ants, there's really no good side to this because they're both just destroying everything. But really, it came down to like John Quarles Jr. coming in and being like, that's a bad idea. We should put a stop to that. So ultimately, the United States government sunk millions of dollars into the production of Mirex, only for it to not come out on top over the fire ants and lead to large, ecological dead zones. Now, there was a lot of hearsay about Mirex being kind of an estrogen-like chemical and something that could kind of, become a hormone imbalance in people. There wasn't a lot of evidence found for that, but honestly, with how crazy this thing looks, nothing would really surprise me at this point. It probably causes heart attacks. It probably latches onto your white blood cells. I mean, just look at it. Throughout this whole process, it's really important to remember that these people really had no idea what they were doing. They really just ignored the fact that it killed everything else. They were seeing the effects on the environment. They were seeing the effects on people, but they continued to move forward because ultimately their goal was to kill something. And as I said at the beginning of the video, to kill a fire ant, you have to kill everything sitting next to it. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. I'm hoping to make more like it. And if you have any ideas for videos that we could be making in the future, please let us know down in the comment. That's all for now, and we will see you guys next time.